The stale scent of burnt coffee and disinfectant hung heavy in the air, a cloying perfume for the midday rush at the daily grind. An old man, his coat frayed at the cuffs and his face a roadmap of hardship, shuffled through the crowded cafe. His eyes, though clouded with a weariness that seemed ancient, scanned the room, searching not for a menu, but for a simple, empty chair. He clutched a small, tattered book to his chest, its title long since rubbed away by the friction of his thumb point. One by one, he approached tables occupied by solitary patrons. A young woman engrossed in her laptop flicked her eyes up at him, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she shook her head curtly and turned back to her screen. A businessman, his suit crisp and his expression severe, simply raised a hand, a silent, dismissive wall. "Sorry, saving this," one person mumbled. "Expecting someone." Another lied, their gaze fixed firmly on their phone. Each rejection was a quiet, sharp jab, a reminder of his apparent invisibility. The murmurs started then, ripples of judgment spreading through the cafe. "Smell that?" one woman whispered to her friend, wrinkling her nose. "He should know better than to come in here." The man's shoulders slumped a little lower with each rebuff. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for food. He was just asking for a place to rest his tired bones, a moment of respite from a world that had seemingly cast him out. He clutched his book tighter, the worn leather a familiar comfort against the cold sting of public scorn. But what no one in that bustling cafe realized was that this man, this vagrant they so easily dismissed, could have bought the entire city block without checking his bank balance. What they couldn't see, beneath the tattered coat and the weary gaze, was Elias Vance, a man running from a ghost that had haunted him for 2 decades, a man who had willingly traded a world of luxury for a pilgrimage of penance. And he had come to this specific place, this unassuming cafe, for a reason that would shatter the foundations of more than one life. His journey was nearing its end, and this public shaming was a crucible he had to pass through. He just didn't know if he had the strength to endure it. Just as the weight of the collective disdain threatened to crush him, a small voice piped up, clear as a bell in the cacophony of clattering cups and hushed judgments. "You can sit here." Elias turned. At a small, 2-person table tucked away in a corner, sat a little girl, no older than 7. Her hair was a cascade of messy blonde curls, and her eyes, wide and blue, held a startling clarity. She had a coloring book open, a half-finished drawing of a lopsided castle in front of her. The chair opposite her was empty. She patted it with a small, inviting hand. "My mommy is just getting juice," she explained, as if that settled the matter. "You can wait with me. I'm Lily." A knot formed in Elias's throat. For weeks, he had been a phantom, a shadow drifting through the city, met with fear, suspicion, or indifference. He had forgotten what simple, unadulterated kindness felt like. He looked into the little girl's eyes and saw something he hadn't seen in years, a person looking at him, not through him. Before he could respond, a harried-looking woman returned, holding a small carton of apple juice. "Lily, honey, what did I say about talking to strangers?" she said, her voice gentle but firm. Her eyes, the same shade of blue as her daughter's, but clouded with a worry that Elias recognized all too well, fell upon him. She saw the worn clothes, the unshaven face, and her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "He needs a seat, Mommy," Lily insisted, her lower lip pushing out in a determined pout. "Everyone is being mean." The woman, Sarah, looked from her daughter's earnest face to the old man's tired one. Every instinct screamed at her to protect her child, to pull her away. But then she saw the book he clutched, the way his knuckles were white, as if it were a lifeline. She saw the profound sadness in his eyes, a depth of sorrow that went beyond simple poverty. And in that moment, something shifted within her. The world had been unkind to her, too. She knew what it felt like to be judged on appearances. Taking a deep breath, she forced a small, hesitant smile. It's all right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He can sit. Just for a minute." Elias Vance lowered himself into the chair, his old bones creaking in protest. He placed the tattered book on the table, its faded cover facing down. He nodded his thanks, unable to find the words. He didn't know it yet, but this simple act of grace, this one small table offered by a little girl in a bustling cafe, was not just a moment of respite. It was the beginning of an avalanche, the first domino to fall in a chain of events that would unearth a devastating secret, expose a network of betrayal, and force a millionaire to finally confront the tragedy he had been running from his entire life. He had come to this place seeking closure, but he was about to find a connection he never imagined, and a responsibility he could no longer ignore. The little girl who offered him a seat had no idea she had just invited a storm into her life. A storm that would either destroy everything she and her mother held dear or, somehow, rebuild their world from the ashes. The days that followed that first encounter at the daily grind settled into a quiet, tentative rhythm. Elias, introducing himself simply as Eli, started frequenting the cafe at the same time every afternoon. He learned that Sarah worked as a freelance graphic designer, her clients few and far between, her laptop a constant companion as she juggled deadlines and motherhood. The cafe was her makeshift office, the one place she could afford a change of scenery while Lily was at school. When Lily joined her after school, she would sit with her coloring books, a silent, well-behaved child who seemed to carry the weight of her mother's worries on her small shoulders. Elias would sit at a nearby table, nursing a single cup of black coffee for hours, observing. He saw the way Sarah's smile never quite reached her eyes when she spoke to clients on the phone, the forced cheerfulness in her voice. He saw her meticulously calculating the cost of a pastry before deciding against it, opting instead to share a small bag of crackers with her daughter. He saw the worn-out soles of Lily's shoes and the faded patch on her backpack. Each detail was a quiet testament to a life lived on the edge, a constant battle against a tide of bills and uncertainty. His heart ached with a familiar pang of guilt. He, who could solve their financial woes with a careless signature, sat by in his self-imposed prison of anonymity. But this was his penance. He had to understand, truly understand, the world he had abandoned, the world his first wife and son would have inhabited had they lived. He couldn't just throw money at the problem. That was the old Elias Vance's solution, a solution that had proven hollow and destructive. This time, it had to be different. It had to be real. One rainy afternoon, as Sarah was packing up, her laptop slipped from her grasp, crashing onto the hard tile floor. The sickening crack of the screen was followed by Sarah's gasp of pure horror. She knelt, her hands trembling as she opened it. A spiderweb of black lines radiated from the corner, rendering the device useless. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of frustration and despair. That laptop was her livelihood. Without it, she was cut off, unemployed. "Oh, no, no, no," she whispered, her voice cracking. Lily, sensing her mother's distress, wrapped her small arms around her neck. Before anyone else could react, Elias was there. He knelt beside her, his voice calm and steady. "Let me see," he said. He took the laptop, his movements surprisingly deft. He tilted it, examining the damage with a practiced eye. "The screen is shattered, but the casing looks intact. The hard drive might be fine. The data is all that matters," Sarah choked out. "But I can't afford to fix it. I can't even afford a diagnostic." Elias looked at her, his gaze direct. "There's a small repair shop a few blocks from here. An old friend of mine runs it. Let me take it. He owes me a favor. No charge." Sarah was hesitant. Trusting a near stranger, a man she knew only as Eli, with her entire professional life, felt reckless. But the desperation in her situation was a powerful motivator. The kindness in his eyes, the same quiet empathy she'd seen that first day, swayed her. She nodded, wiping her tears. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." The next day, Elias returned the laptop. A brand new screen gleamed, the desktop lighting up perfectly. Sarah was speechless. "How?" "My friend is a miracle worker," Elias said, with a small smile, deflecting her gratitude. But it wasn't a friend. Elias had walked into the nearest high-end electronics store, purchased an identical, brand-new laptop, and had a technician transfer Sarah's hard drive overnight. He paid in cash, a thick wad of bills that made the young cashier's eyes widen. The old, broken laptop was now sitting at the bottom of a dumpster. This act of clandestine generosity solidified a bond between them. Sarah began to confide in him, telling him about her struggles to find steady work, the constant fear of eviction from their tiny apartment, her dream of one day giving Lily a small yard to play in. Elias listened, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He learned that Sarah's husband had left them years ago, vanishing without a trace, leaving her to raise their daughter alone. Her story was one of quiet resilience, of a mother's fierce, unwavering love in the face of relentless hardship. His growing affection for Sarah and Lily was complicated by a gnawing internal conflict. He was living a lie, a deception that felt more profound with each passing day. He wanted to help them, to lift their burdens, but he was terrified of the consequences of revealing his true identity. The name Elias Vance was synonymous with corporate power, with cold, calculated business deals, and with a public tragedy that had been splashed across headlines 20 years ago. To them, he was Eli, the kind, quiet old man. To the world, he was a recluse, a ghost. Re-entering that world meant confronting the very demons he had fled, but he knew he couldn't remain a passive observer forever. He needed to be closer, too. Understand the ecosystem of this place that held such a strange, painful pull on him. He saw a help wanted sign in the cafe window. Dishwasher. Part-time. Without a second thought, he walked up to the counter and asked for the manager. The manager was the cafe's owner, a man named Arthur Thompson. Thompson was a man whose personality was as bitter as his over-roasted coffee beans. He looked Elias up and down, his lip curling in unconcealed disgust. You're a bit long in the tooth for this kind of work, aren't you, old-timer? I'm a hard worker, Elias said, his voice even, betraying none of the fury he felt at the man's condescension. He had once commanded boardrooms filled with titans of industry. Now he was begging for a job scrubbing plates from a man who couldn't manage a simple inventory. Thompson laughed, a short, barking sound. Fine. I'm desperate. Don't expect any special treatment. You're slow, you're fired. You break anything, it comes out of your pay. And so, Elias Vance, the billionaire, began his new life as Eli, the dishwasher. From the sweltering heat of the back kitchen, he had a new vantage point. He saw the way Thompson treated his staff, docking their pay for minor infractions, berating them in front of customers. He saw the fear in the eyes of the young baristas, students trying to make ends meet. He saw the systemic cruelty of a man who saw people not as human beings, but as costs on a spreadsheet. And he noticed something else, something that sent a chill down his spine. Thompson's last name. He had heard it before, a long time ago, in a context that made his blood run cold. He tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but the seed of suspicion was planted. This cafe, this man, this street. It was all connected. But the full, terrifying shape of that connection was still shrouded in the fog of his past. And in another part of the country, a young man named Daniel Vance was staring at a map, a red pin marking the very city where his father was now washing dishes. Daniel, Elias's estranged son from his second marriage, had spent 5 years searching for the father who had walked away from his life with nothing but a cryptic note. He had hired private investigators, followed dead-end leads, and chased shadows. But now, a new piece of information had surfaced, a faint financial echo from their family's past, a thread that led directly to the daily grind. Daniel packed his bags. He was done waiting. He was going to find his father and demand the answers. He had been denied for so long. The storm was gathering, and its eye was a small, unassuming cafe where a little girl had once offered a kind word to a broken man. The kitchen of the daily grind became Elias's monastery, a place of steam, clatter, and grueling labor. His hands, once accustomed to the smooth leather of a Bentley steering wheel, were now raw and chapped from the scalding water and harsh detergents. He worked with a silent, methodical efficiency that surprised the other kitchen staff. They were used to a revolving door of disgruntled teenagers who would last a week, at best. Eli, the quiet old man, was different. He was reliable, he was thorough, and he never complained. His position gave him an unfiltered view into the heart of the establishment, and what he saw churned his stomach. He saw Thompson pocketing tips left for the waitstaff. He saw him watering down the syrups and using day-old pastries, repackaging them as freshly baked. It was a business built on 1,000 tiny deceptions, all to bolster the ego and wallet of one greedy man. Elias documented it all, mentally filing away each transgression. The old Elias, the corporate raider, would have seen this as a poorly run business ripe for a hostile takeover. The new Elias saw it as a web of injustice, trapping good people like Sarah and the young baristas in its threads. His friendship with Sarah and Lily deepened. During his breaks, he would sit with them, sharing stories, carefully edited versions of his life, of course. He spoke of a life lived on the road, of working odd jobs, of a family he had lost long ago. He never lied, but he curated the truth, presenting a mosaic of a life of humble hardship. In return, Sarah opened up more about her own anxieties. The landlord of their apartment building had just issued a notice. The building had been sold, and the new owner was planning a full renovation, which meant all current tenants would be evicted within 60 days. "I don't know what we're going to do, Eli," she confessed one afternoon, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The rents everywhere else have skyrocketed. We'll be on the street." Lily, coloring quietly beside them, looked up. "Don't worry, Mommy," she said with the unshakable faith of a child. "Eli will help us. He fixes things." The innocent words pierced Elias's heart. He could fix this. A single phone call to his wealth manager, and he could buy the entire building outright. He could give Sarah and Lily a home for life. But the promise he had made to himself held him back. This was not about easy fixes. It was about understanding the system that created such desperation in the first place. And a more sinister thought began to form in his mind. He asked Sarah for the name of the company that had bought her building. She told him, Thorne Thompson Properties. Thorne. The name hit him like a physical blow. Marcus Thorne, his former best friend, his business partner, the man who had stood by his side as they built their empire from the ground up, and the man who had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way possible. The coincidence was too great. Thompson, the cruel cafe owner, and Thorne, his old nemesis, were now linked. This wasn't just a random act of corporate expansion. This felt personal. It felt like a ghost reaching out from the past to strangle his present. The rising action was escalating on another front as well. Daniel Vance arrived in the city. He was his father's son in more ways than one, sharp, determined, and relentless. He didn't storm the city looking for a man in a tattered coat. He began his search the way Elias would have, by analyzing the data. The financial thread that led him here was a small, recurring trust payment made to an old, defunct holding company, a company whose only remaining asset was the deed to a single commercial property, the property that housed the daily grind. Daniel started his surveillance not on the people, but on the place. He sat for hours in his car across the street, taking pictures, running background checks on the employees. He saw the surly owner, Arthur Thompson. He saw the struggling single mother, Sarah. And then, one afternoon, he saw him, an old man, bent and weary, emerging from the back entrance, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a raw, red hand. His hair was gray, his face lined with care, but the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the intensity in his eyes as he looked across the street, it was unmistakably his father. Daniel felt a surge of conflicting emotions: rage, relief, confusion. His father, the legendary Elias Vance, a titan of industry, was washing dishes in a greasy spoon cafe? It made no sense. This wasn't a man who had retired to a quiet life. This was a man in hiding, a man performing some strange, public act of self-flagellation. Daniel's first instinct was to confront him, to storm across the street and demand answers. But he stopped himself. If his father had gone to such extreme lengths to disappear, a direct confrontation might just make him run again. No, he had to understand the why. He had to uncover the secret that had driven his powerful father to this. Daniel, like his father, began to watch. He created a parallel investigation, digging into the history of the cafe, the owner Arthur Thompson, and the recent acquisition of the apartment building by Thorne Thompson Properties. He unearthed old city records, newspaper articles, and legal documents, piecing together a puzzle that was 20 years old. Meanwhile, Elias's own investigation was yielding terrifying results. He used an old, untraceable burner phone to contact his most trusted confidant, his former lawyer, Julian Croft. "Julian," he rasped, his voice unfamiliar even to himself. "I need you to look into a company, Thorne Thompson Properties. Specifically, its connection to Arthur Thompson of the Daily Grind." Julian, who had faithfully managed Elias's silent empire for years, was shocked to hear from him, but he asked no questions. The information he delivered a few days later was chilling. Arthur Thompson was the cousin of Marcus Thorne, and the cafe, the Daily Grind, was built on the exact plot of land where Elias's first family home had stood, the home that had burned to the ground 20 years ago, with his wife, Eleanor, and their young son, Thomas, inside. The memory, the one he had tried to suppress for 2 decades, came roaring back. It wasn't just a fire. It was arson. Elias had been on the verge of exposing a massive fraud scheme orchestrated by a junior partner in his firm. That partner was Marcus Thorne. The fire was meant as a warning, a message to back off. But it had gone horribly wrong. The authorities had ruled it an accident, a faulty wire. The evidence was inconclusive, and Marcus, with his cousin Arthur providing a false alibi, had walked away clean. Elias, consumed by a grief so profound it shattered his soul, sold his half of the company to Marcus for a pittance and simply vanished, unable to bear the world they had built together, a world paid for with the blood of his family. Now, it all clicked into place. This wasn't a coincidence. Marcus and his cousin had deliberately built this cafe on the ashes of his past, a final, cruel monument to their victory. And now, they were trying to evict Sarah and Lily, twisting the knife, destroying the one small pocket of kindness he had found in his desolate life. The rage that filled him was cold and absolute. This was no longer about penance. This was about justice. The foreshadowing he'd felt, the pull of this place, it was all leading to this moment. The time for hiding was over. The ghost of Elias Vance was about to return, and hell was coming with him. The revelation struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled out of the kitchen, gasping for air, the steam and heat suddenly suffocating. He leaned against the cool brick of the alleyway, the city's cacophony fading to a dull roar in his ears. The Daily Grind. His family's grave. Arthur Thompson, the gatekeeper of his personal hell. Marcus Thorne, the architect of his ruin, now reaching across 2 decades to torment him anew. The pieces clicked together not with a sense of discovery, but with the sickening finality of a coffin lid being nailed shut. His pilgrimage had been a search for atonement, a quest to understand suffering. But he now saw it for what it was, a self-indulgent flight from a battle he should have fought 20 years ago. He had allowed his grief to paralyze him, letting the guilty go unpunished. He had run away, leaving a legacy of pain to fester, a wound that was now infecting the lives of innocent people like Sarah and Lily. He looked at his raw, calloused hands. They were the hands of a dishwasher, but they had once been the hands that signed deals worth billions, hands that could crush men like Thorne and Thompson. He had forsaken that power, believing it to be the source of his misery. Now he realized it was his only weapon for justice. That evening, the midpoint of his journey arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating choice. Sarah received her official eviction notice. She sat at her usual table, the crisp, legal document spread before her like a death sentence. Lily, sensing the gravity, was uncharacteristically subdued, her crayons lying untouched. 60 days, Eli, Sarah whispered, her face pale. 60 days until we're homeless. Elias looked at her, at the raw terror in her eyes, and then at Lily, who was looking up at him with that same unwavering faith. He fixes things. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls between Eli the dishwasher and Elias Vance the billionaire crumbled to dust. The internal conflict was over. He could not stand by and watch this happen. He reached across the table and gently took the eviction notice from Sarah's trembling hands. "This won't stand," he said, his voice different. The weary rasp was gone, replaced by a quiet authority that made Sarah look up, startled. "This company, Thorne Thompson Properties, is run by criminals. I know them, and I am going to stop them." Sarah stared at him, confused. "You? Eli, what are you talking about? How could you possibly know people like that?" He held her gaze. The time for half-truths was over. "My name," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue after so long, "is not Eli. It's Elias. Elias Vance." The name meant nothing to her. It was the name of a ghost, a recluse who hadn't been seen in public for 2 decades. I don't understand," she stammered. "Marcus Thorne was my business partner," Elias continued, his voice low and intense. "He destroyed my family. And this cafe? This cafe is built on the land where they died." The air grew thick with the weight of his confession. Sarah could only stare, her own problems momentarily forgotten, eclipsed by the sheer magnitude of the tragedy in his eyes. This quiet, kind old man was carrying a sorrow so immense it was almost incomprehensible. She finally understood the source of his deep-seated sadness, the reason for his self-imposed exile. Across the street, Daniel Vance watched the scene unfold through a pair of binoculars. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the intensity of the exchange. He saw his father, his posture transformed, no longer stooped, but upright, powerful. He saw the shock on Sarah's face. He knew, instinctively, that the charade was over. His father was re-engaging with the world, and Daniel knew he had to act fast, before whatever his father was planning spun out of control, that Elias's transformation was immediate and total. He walked away from Sarah's table and went straight to Arthur Thompson's office, a cramped, messy room in the back. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door and walked in. Thompson looked up from his ledger, his face contorting in rage. "What do you think you're doing, old man? You're fired. Get out." Elias closed the door behind him. "My name is Elias Vance," he said calmly. The name, this time, had its intended effect. Thompson's face went white. He visibly shrank in his chair, the bluster draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. He knew the name. Of course, he knew the name. His cousin Marcus had built his entire fortune on the ashes of Elias Vance's life. You're supposed to be dead," Thompson stammered. "A common misconception," Elias said, his voice like ice. "I've been washing your dishes, Arthur. I've been watching you cheat your employees and swindle your customers. But that's child's play compared to your other crimes. Like providing a false alibi for your cousin 20 years ago, the night my family was murdered." Panic flared in Thompson's eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Elias said, taking a step closer. "And you're going to help me prove it. You are going to call Marcus. You're going to tell him that Elias Vance is back. And you are going to record the conversation." This was the twist, the deeper reveal laid bare. Elias wasn't just seeking personal vengeance. He was setting a trap. He was using his knowledge, his presence, as bait. He was forcing the players back onto the board, this time on his terms. The game had begun anew, and the quiet dishwasher had just revealed himself as the king. He was no longer running from his past. He was weaponizing it. And as Arthur Thompson sat there, trembling under the gaze of the man he had wronged, he knew that his world and his cousin's was about to come crashing down. The call was made. Thompson, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone, did as he was told. Under the cold, unwavering gaze of Elias, he stammered out the news to his cousin. "Marcus, it's him. He's here. Elias Vance. He knows everything." The voice, on the other end of the line, once smooth and confident, was now laced with pure, unadulterated panic. Marcus Thorne, a man insulated by 2 decades of wealth and power, was suddenly vulnerable. The ghost he thought long buried had risen from the grave. "Stay calm, Arthur. Don't do anything stupid. Where is he?" "I'm on my way." This was exactly what Elias had anticipated. Marcus was arrogant. He would never delegate this. He would have to see it for himself, to control the situation personally. The trap was set. The next 24 hours were a blur of calculated preparation. Elias made a single, encrypted call to his lawyer, Julian Croft, issuing a series of precise instructions. Assets were to be moved, legal teams put on standby, and a dossier, compiled over years by Julian on the off chance this day would ever come, was to be prepared for dissemination. This dossier contained every piece of circumstantial evidence, linking Marcus Thorne to the fire, every financial anomaly, every hushed-up witness account. It wasn't enough to convict him in a court of law 20 years ago, but in the court of public opinion, combined with a new confession, it would be a death sentence. Meanwhile, Daniel Vance made his move. He approached Sarah, introducing himself, not as Elias's son, but as a private investigator looking into Thorne Thompson properties. Sarah, still reeling from Elias's revelation, was wary, but Daniel's knowledge of the situation was so specific, his demeanor so sincere, that she found herself trusting him. He explained that her eviction was part of a much larger, darker story. "The man you know as Eli is my father," Daniel finally admitted. "He's not a bad man, but he's a broken one. He's about to confront the person who destroyed his life, and It's going to be dangerous. I need to be there to make sure he survives it. The climax was set for the following afternoon, back where it all began, the daily grind. The air in the cafe was thick with an unspoken tension. The regular customers were oblivious, but the staff could feel it. Arthur Thompson was a nervous wreck, his face ashen, his usual sneer replaced by a constant, twitching grimace. Sarah and Lily were there, sitting at their corner table, not as patrons, but as witnesses. Lily, understanding only that her friend Eli was in trouble, clutched his old, tattered book, holding it for safekeeping. Daniel was seated at the counter, a silent guardian, his eyes scanning every person who walked through the door. Elias was in the kitchen, not washing dishes, but waiting. He had shed his tattered coat, wearing a simple, clean shirt and trousers. The disguise was gone. He was no longer Eli. He was Elias Vance, resurrected. At precisely 3 p.m., a sleek, black town car pulled up outside. Marcus Thorne stepped out. He was impeccably dressed, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, but his face was a mask of anxiety. He strode into the cafe, his eyes locking immediately on his cousin, Arthur, who was sweating profusely behind the counter. "Where is he?" Marcus demanded, his voice a low hiss. "Right here, Marcus." Elias stepped out from the kitchen. The two men faced each other for the first time in 20 years. The cafe fell silent. The sight of them, two titans of a bygone era, one weathered by grief, the other bloated by stolen success, was an arresting tableau. "Elias," Marcus breathed, a faint, incredulous smile playing on his lips. "I'd heard rumors. I never thought. After all this time, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "There's no pleasure in this," Elias said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I came back for the truth, Marcus. I want to hear you say it. Why did you kill my family?" Marcus laughed, a hollow, theatrical sound. "Kill your family? Elias, you poor man. Grief has finally rotted your brain. It was a tragic accident. You know that. Was it an accident when you hired your cousin Arthur to set the fire as a warning?" Elias pressed, his voice rising. "A warning? To stop me from exposing the fraud that was the foundation of your entire career." At the counter, Daniel quietly activated a recording device on his phone. Sarah hugged Lily closer, shielding her from the venom in the room. "This is insane," Marcus spat, his composure beginning to crack. "You have no proof." "Don't I?" Elias took a step closer. "Let's talk about Arthur's new car, purchased in cash the week after the fire. Let's talk about the offshore account you set up in his name. Let's talk about the witness, a disgruntled employee you paid to keep quiet, who saw Arthur's car near my house that night. An employee my lawyer has been in contact with for the past 5 years." Every word was a hammer blow, chipping away at Marcus's facade. He glanced wildly at Arthur, who looked like he was about to faint. "He's lying, Marcus. He's bluffing." "Am I?" Elias's voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "You didn't just take my company. You took my wife. You took my son. You built your empire on their bones. This very building stands as a monument to your depravity. You will not take one more thing from me. You will not take this woman's home. You will not terrorize these people any longer." Desperate, Marcus lunged, not at Elias, but at Sarah. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her from her chair. "You want to play this game, Elias? Fine. Let's see how much your new friends mean to you." But before he could drag her any further, Daniel was there. He moved with a speed and precision that belied his calm demeanor, twisting Marcus's arm behind his back in a single, fluid motion, forcing him to his knees. "Get your hands off her," Daniel growled, his voice vibrating with a protective fury he didn't know he possessed. The doors of the cafe burst open, and two uniformed police officers, alerted by a silent alarm Daniel had triggered, strode in. It was over. Checkmate. Marcus Thorne, a pillar of the community, was on his knees, his carefully crafted world imploding around him. Elias stood over him, not with triumph in his eyes, but with a profound, weary sadness. He had won. He had exposed the monster. But it wouldn't bring his family back. As Marcus was handcuffed, his wild eyes met Elias's. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. "This changes nothing. You're still the man who couldn't protect them." The words were meant to be his final, venomous strike, but they landed without force. Because as Elias looked past the shell of the man who had ruined him, he saw his son, Daniel, standing protectively in front of Sarah. He saw Lily, her eyes wide with fear, but still clutching his old book. He had failed to protect his first family, a truth he would carry forever. But here, now, was a new one, forged in the fires of this confrontation. And this time, he would not fail. The climax wasn't just about justice for the past. It was about accepting responsibility for the future. The aftermath of the confrontation at the Daily Grind sent shockwaves through the city. The arrest of Marcus Thorne, a celebrated philanthropist and business leader, on charges of conspiracy and his connection to a 20-year-old arson and murder case, was a front-page scandal. Daniel's recording, coupled with the dossier Julian Croft released to the press, was irrefutable. Arthur Thompson, in exchange for a lighter sentence, gave a full confession, corroborating every detail of Elias's accusation. The Thorne Empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled overnight. But for Elias, the public victory was secondary. The true resolution began in the quiet moments that followed the chaos. As the police led Marcus and Arthur away, Elias finally turned to face his son. The two men stood in the now empty cafe, the years of silence and misunderstanding stretching between them like a chasm. "Dad," Daniel began, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't have to come," Elias said, his voice raspy. "This wasn't your fight." "Yes, it was," Daniel insisted, taking a step closer. "You're my father. For years, I hated you for leaving. I thought you were a coward. I didn't understand that you weren't running away from me. You were running from them." He gestured to the empty space where his half-brother, a boy he'd never met, had once lived. Tears welled in Elias's eyes, the first he had allowed himself to shed in 2 decades. "I was a coward, Daniel. I let my grief consume me. I buried myself, and in doing so, I buried a part of you too. I can never give you back those years. I can only say I'm sorry." "You don't have to," Daniel said, closing the distance between them and wrapping his arms around his father. "Just don't disappear again." In that embrace, 2 decades of pain began to dissolve. It was not a perfect absolution, but it was a beginning, a foundation on which they could rebuild. Elias's transformation was not just emotional, but practical. He was no longer a ghost. He was Elias Vance, a man with immense resources and a newfound purpose. His first act was to dissolve Thorne Thompson Properties. Using his own capital, he purchased all of its assets, including Sarah's apartment building. He immediately nullified all eviction notices, assuring the tenants their homes were safe. But he didn't stop there. He went to Sarah, who was still trying to process the seismic shift in her reality. The quiet dishwasher she had befriended was one of the wealthiest men in the country. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he told her, his sincerity absolute. "You and Lily, that you showed me a kindness I thought no longer existed. You reminded me what it means to be human." He handed her a set of keys and a legal document. It was the deed to the Daily Grind. "It's yours," he said. "The whole building. I've set up a trust to cover all expenses, renovations, everything. I want you to turn it into whatever you want. A real community coffee house. A place where no one is ever made to feel unwelcome." Sarah was stunned into silence, tears streaming down her face. It was an act of generosity, so vast it was difficult to comprehend. "But why?" she finally managed to ask. "Because this place was built on a foundation of pain," Elias explained. "I want to see it rebuilt on a foundation of kindness. Your kindness." He then offered her a salaried position as the director of a new charitable foundation he was establishing, the Eleanor and Thomas Vance Foundation, dedicated to providing housing assistance and support for single-parent families. He wasn't just giving her a handout. He was giving her a career, a purpose, and the security she had only ever dreamed of. His transformation was complete. He had shed the sackcloth of his grief and donned the mantle of a reluctant leader. He didn't return to the world of corporate raiding and hostile takeovers. Instead, he channeled his wealth and business acumen into systemic change. He started affordable housing projects, funded legal aid for the disenfranchised, and created job training programs. He was using his power not to accumulate more wealth, but to dismantle the very systems of greed and cruelty that men like Marcus Thorne thrived on. Months later, the Daily Grind reopened. It was renamed Lily's Place. The interior was bright and warm, filled with comfortable chairs, local art, and a small play area for children. The bitter, burnt coffee was replaced with high-quality, ethically sourced beans. Sarah, no longer harried and anxious, managed the cafe with a confident grace, offering fair wages and a supportive environment for her staff. The final scene of this chapter of their lives takes place on a sunny afternoon. Elias, now dressed in a comfortable sweater and slacks, sits at the very same corner table where Lily had first offered him a seat. Across from him, Lily is drawing in a new coloring book, her castle now perfectly symmetrical, with a big, smiling sun shining down on it. Sarah brings over 3 cups of hot chocolate, sitting down with them. Daniel arrives a few moments later, sliding into the seat beside his father, a comfortable, easy smile on his face. Elias looks around at the bustling, happy cafe, at the new family he has found, at the second chance he never thought he deserved. He picks up the old, tattered book that Lily had saved for him. It was a collection of poems by Rumi, a gift from his first wife, Eleanor. He opens it to a bookmarked page, a passage she had underlined all those years ago. The wound is the place where the light enters you. For 20 years, he had been consumed by the wound. He had hidden in the darkness. But a little girl, with an act of simple, profound kindness, had opened a crack and let the light back in. He was no longer defined by his loss, but by the love he was now able to give and receive. His fortune was no longer measured in dollars, but in the warmth of a shared table and the sound of a child's happy laughter. Some might say this was fate, a cosmic rebalancing of the scales. Others might call it choice, the choice of a little girl to be kind, the choice of a mother to be trusting, and the final, difficult choice of a broken man to stop running and finally fight for the light. Whichever it is, the story of the millionaire in the tattered coat reminds us that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, and that sometimes the most powerful investment we can ever make is in each other. What do you think? Was it destiny, or did their choices shape their future? Let us know in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, and you believe in the power of second chances, make sure to subscribe, because there are many more waiting to be told.